A few Christmases ago, I was driving my kids back from visiting their grandparents out in the countryside. They moved out to this big old house once my dad sold his business, one of those offers he couldn't refuse type things that meant he could retire like 10 years earlier than expected. The house is amazing, but the only problem is that it's in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where the nearest village is like 20 minutes drive away. It's also one heck of a drive to and from the place, one that involves traversing some pretty secluded stretches of motorway. So like I said, it's maybe only a week before Christmas. It's the 16th or 17th of December, and my kids are really bloody excited about it. My wee lad is still 5 years old, a true Santa believer, while my daughter had only just turned 9, so they're starting to cotton on that something isn't quite right about the whole thing, but they still sort of want to believe, if that makes any sense. So when they see a hand-painted Christmas light dripping sign that says something like Santa's Grotto 9 miles, they start going ballistic in the back seat, demanding I take them to see Santa. At first, I straight up refuse. It was a long enough drive without pulling into some lay-by to spend the better part of an hour nattering away with some old fella in a red suit. But the pair of them throw an absolute fit, to the point where I decided I would get far more peace if I just capitulated and let them spend a few minutes indulging their childish imaginations. Like I said, my eldest was just on the cusp of figuring out that Santa was just Mom and Dad sneaking out in the middle of the night to take their presents out of the car boot before stashing them under the Christmas tree. And every time I imagined her getting older, getting wiser, figuring things out, becoming a young adult, it had me choking up like nobody's business. So I suppose I just wanted to enjoy their naivete just a wee bit longer. Besides, once she'd figured out the truth, it was only a matter of time before she spilled the beans to my youngest. And that was a day I most definitely wasn't looking forward to. So after a few more signs like Santa's Grotto 3 miles, I finally see the turnoff that I needed to take to get to the grotto. It takes me down this long, dark dirt track that at first I thought might have been the wrong turnoff. But lo and behold, after about 5 minutes or so, I see another one of those janky hand-painted signs for Santa's Grotto. The kids are just about ready to burst at this point, but I make it clear that we're not staying any longer than 10 minutes, and they're to be on their best behavior, leaving when I tell them to leave, lest Santa see what bad little children they are. The threat of coal in their stockings was more than enough to have them promising to be good. Anyway, I expected a quaint little winter wonderland type thing with a few other families milling around, but the place was barely even decorated and looked completely deserted. It was little more than porta-cabin with a few caravans parked around it. Like I'm not messing when I say whoever was in charge of this place had put more effort into decorating the road signs than the actual site itself. I had a bad feeling from the get-go, but I knew better than to reverse myself and tell the kids to get back in the car. They'd have gone absolutely mental getting so close to meeting Santa only to be told that I'd just up and change my mind. So, against my better judgment, I decided to give the place a chance. We walked up to the porta-cabin, which seems to be the place where the grotto was, and knocked on the door. There was no reply at first, so we knocked again, and as we did so, one of the doors to the caravan swings open, and this heavier-set older fellow with a big gray beard sticks his head out and gives me a death stare. I look over at him, and in my cheeriest voice I ask, "We're here to see Santa. Is he around?" I give a quick nod towards the kids as if to say the fella who I was guessing was the one playing Santa to get himself together so the kids wouldn't throw a fit. He doesn't say a word at first. He just stares at me almost like looking through me like there was nothing behind his eyes at all. He finally says something like, "I'll go fetch him," then shuts the door, only to re-emerge a few moments later dressed in what was without a doubt the worst-looking Santa suit I've ever seen in my life. Not only was it lacking any kind of white felt, there was no belt or anything. The bloke had pretty much just thrown together a collection of red clothes and then whacked on a cheap Santa hat to round the look off. On top of that, the clothes were absolutely filthy, covered in grease stains with a collection of what appeared to be his cigarette burns in the pants. He walked towards the kids and asked them if they were excited to see him. They gave each other this cartoonish look as if to say, "Who is this guy?" and the bloke has to repeat the question in a characteristically festive voice before they even really twig to the fact that this was Santa Claus. They just sort of nod at first, watching in confusion as he takes out the key from the red pants and unlocks the porta-cabin before beckoning them inside. The interior was absolutely terrifying. Like I'm a grown woman, and even I got the creeps from stepping inside that thing. It was dark and grimy, and the use of cheap Christmas lights managed to give the place a kind of festive torture chamber type vibe, as opposed to the cozy grotto feeling they were obviously aiming for. The crowning piece of creepiness was the fact that mounted on one wall was what I guessed was an old sheep's skull that had some plastic deer antlers taped or glued to the top of it. It would have been creepy enough in broad daylight, but the fact that it was being partially, then fully illuminated by red and green flashing lights gave it a truly hellish aesthetic. Santa sat down on a grubby old couch that stunk of pee and old ale, then smacked his knees as if to invite the kids to go sit on his lap. Neither of them moved. Their lack of reaction prompted Santa to give them something of a scowl before he very curtly asked them what each of them wanted for Christmas. Both of the kids were so nervous by that point that I had to prompt them to reply. The awkward exchange went on for a few more minutes until I turned to the kids and told them we had to leave. As I'm ushering the kids out of the porta-cabin and back towards the car, I feel a hand grab the crook of my arm and squeeze. I turn to see Santa's face pushed right into mine, his breath reeking of ciggies and hard booze. £50, he hissed. Sorry, Santa. I haven't got anything on me, I said, trying to be as polite as possible, maintaining a passive-aggressive tone. But I promise me and my husband will leave out some extra brandy and mince pies for you on Christmas night, just to make up for it. I don't even know I was keeping up the pretense by that point. I'm pretty sure the whole experience had scarred my wee lad for life and had pretty much destroyed any remaining festive belief in my daughter. Santa growled back at me, calling me an expletive. I just keep pushing my kids back towards the car, turning back briefly to see that Santa is no longer alone. He was never alone. A gang of other people have filed out of the caravans and are following us back towards where I'd parked the car, then starts off the chorus of, "Where do you think you're going, love? You haven't paid. He told you £50, get your purse out, or we'll get it out for you." My kids were on the verge of tears at that point, and if I'm being honest, I wasn't far off either. I gave in, took out my purse, and started sifting through it to see if I had 50 in notes on me. Right as I'm doing that, this kid, this actual bloody child, just snatches the whole thing out of my hand and runs back towards the caravan with it, only to be goaded on by the gang of skanky-looking grown-ups going, "Good lad, that'll teach her. She needs to learn some generosity. It is Christmas, after all." I didn't do a bloody thing, well, aside from getting in the car and driving off. The damage control from that bit of horribleness was a lot of work. I'm pretty sure it was the singular event that broke my eldest kid's belief, and we had to reassure my youngest over and over that he was just a bad man pretending to be Santa, and that the real Santa would most definitely be putting him on the naughty list for what he'd done. But honestly, I think it's me that belongs on the naughty list for putting my kids in that position in the first place, and for putting myself in the most terrifying Christmas-related event I'd ever gone through. Far, far scarier than my first Christmas with my mother-in-law, if you can believe that. I go to an all-girls boarding school, and there are 9 junior and 4 senior boarding houses. The junior houses are for girls between 11 to 16, and the senior houses are for girls 16 to 18. At the beginning of September 2016, I moved out of my junior house into my new senior house, which, for the sake of not bringing my school into this, we'll call Robinson. Robinson was different from the other houses in that you only stayed for a year, but that you stayed with another person in a double room, as opposed to the single rooms like other senior boarding houses, and I chose to share with my best friend, Georgia. For various reasons, I ended up going back to school 2 days early with only a handful of other girls. I get told to go to my room, and I discover that it's in the basement of the house, tucked into a corner with 2 other rooms. The minute I was in the room, I felt something was off, like really, really off. It was like there was this nasty aura in the room, like I wasn't alone in the room. I'm really into ghost stories and the paranormal, so all those stories started to kick in. That being said, I have pretty bad anxiety, so I told myself it was that and tried to ignore it. I unpacked, and since Georgia isn't there yet, I get to pick which one of the beds, which desk, and which drawers I want. I chose one that's on the far side of the room, with the end facing the open doorway that leads to the space where you can either turn right and go to the toilet, or go left and go to the door to the rest of the house. This room is absolutely huge, so I can space out my stuff, and I'm pretty happy about it. At about 9, I decide that enough's enough and I should go to sleep. I turn the main lights out and get into bed and try to go to sleep and pull the duvet over my head. I then proceed to spend the next 5 hours absolutely terrified. That feeling that something's in the room is amplified 1,000 times, and it's made worse by the fact that I can hear things, shuffling in the dark, soft scratching on the carpet, and creaks of people sitting on wood. I'm absolutely sure that I've heard someone breathing near my head at some point during the night. I'm so terrified that I have to psych myself up to even change position, sure that something will jump onto me. I'm exhausted in the morning, and when I finally woke up, I realized that although it's not as strong or as powerful as during the night, the feeling that something is in the room with me is still there. It's awful, like something is hanging onto my back and waiting for me to turn my back so it can jump at me. My roommate comes back about 3 days later, and I notice she hardly seems to notice the atmosphere in the room, which seems so painfully obvious to me, and happily puts away all of her stuff. That feeling that there's something in the room was honestly terrifying. I couldn't study in silence. I had to have music on so that I could attempt to block out this feeling, and I always left my phone on with YouTube videos playing when I had to go to the toilet, just to make me feel like if I came back out into the room, I wouldn't have to see something standing in the room, silently waiting for me. It sounds really stupid, but it was the only way I could reassure myself. The feeling that I was being watched was always most clearer at night. It's probably because I was on my own and didn't have anything else to do but try and go to sleep, but whatever reason, it genuinely scared me. I'd asked in other rooms in the house. There are 4 floors in total, including the basement, and been into other rooms, and it feels like a nice normal room, and nobody in them ever felt like they were ever being watched. The worst place where it happened was the open doorway, the one that my bed faces. In the beginning, it was easy to ignore, the feeling of being watched only happening every now and then, but as time went on, it got worse and worse. At the worst, it felt as though a grown man was standing in the doorway, barring the way, staring at my bed, and it was as though I could physically feel the presence there. It was so strong. One night, when it was particularly bad, I tried to shrug it off and get to sleep. I have a habit of bringing up one leg to my chest for a bit and then bringing it back down. That night, I brought my leg up, felt the presence, brushed it off, and began to lower my leg back down. As I did, to my absolute horror, I felt the edge of the mattress sink downwards, as though somebody had suddenly sat on it, and I felt what felt like a hand resting on top of my foot. Straight away, I brought my legs to my chest and curled up like that for the rest of the night. I was really on edge from that, so for the next few weeks I made sure to check the doorway before to reassure myself that there's nothing there. About 3 weeks later, Georgia and I are talking about a play we both like, and since our beds are on the opposite sides of the room, I sometimes couldn't make out what she was saying. Anyways, Georgia makes some point, and I couldn't hear what she said, so I turned over from my position of facing the wall and lift up the duvet to face her bed. I lift my head, and I see a dark shadow above her desk of drawers, floating above the books she has on top of it. We had the curtains open, so a shriek of light from a street lamp was shining through the window into our room, since our windows open out onto the car park, and in it, I could see the shadow was in the shape of a head and shoulders, with the head facing the window, all in pitch-dark shadow, so I couldn't make out any features but what seemed to be a prominent Roman nose. I freaked out, yanked the duvet over my head and faced the wall. It felt wrong, like something that shouldn't be there. It really set me off, and since then I got really wary of something actually being in the room, and there are 2 other incidences that occurred and convinced it for me that something was in the room. The first was when I was under my desk, looking for some socks to wear to dinner, and as I dragged myself out of the desk, I reached behind me for my jumper and glanced to see where it was. And as I did, I got a glimpse of a light blue woolen peacoat standing directly behind me, just above my shoulder, so close that I saw the way the light glinted in the buttons, and I could only make out just that the arms of the coat were inside the pockets. I stood up as fast as I could, and I saw that the coat, and presumably the wearer, had vanished. I didn't even hesitate and just legged it out of the place, and refused to go back in for another hour until I knew that my roommate was back in the house. The worst incident was also the last. It was Sunday morning, and we're allowed lie-ins. I was asleep when suddenly I became aware of the fact that I was asleep and lying in bed. I suppose it's what you could call a lucid dream, but I'm not sure as it's never actually happened to me before. I didn't have enough time to focus on it because next thing I knew, there was a feeling of something being near me, and then a feeling that something was by my head, and I felt a presence standing by my head, leaning over me, so solid that it felt like another human being was right there, even through the fog of my sleeping mind. I didn't have enough time to realize what was happening until I felt a hand, a solid, warm human hand, touch my head and the bit just under my ears and start to stroke it. And I swear to Christ and back again that a voice began to make a noise in my ear, like a weird moaning sound, or like someone was sobbing with their mouth closed, muffling the sounds of sobs. I wasn't sure if it was real, but I sure wasn't taking any chances if it wasn't a dream, so I twisted myself away from it and screamed out loud, "Georgia! Georgia!" Georgia bolted up and looked around as I tore my covers off and looked around my area. She looked really confused, as though she hadn't seen anything, and I thought that maybe it had been a dream, until I noticed that my wall calendar that was pinned up to my notice board above my head had been ripped off the wall and was lying on the floor by my bed, despite the fact that it was definitely pinned up securely the night before. It never got as bad as that again. The feeling of being watched slowly began to stop after that, and the negative aura in the room and the small sounds I would have heard in the night started to stop as well. And when I came back from the Christmas holidays in January, it was barely here. The presents had all but vanished, and it felt like the rest of the dorm rooms in Robinson. Over Christmas, I decided to do a bit of research into Robinson to figure out what could explain what was going on. I found out that Robinson has been a hotel before my boarding school had purchased it, which is why the rooms were so big and why they still had ensuite bathrooms, and you could actually still see the old wallpaper that had been painted over in some of the rooms. The town where my school was a really big place for spying and espionage during the Cold War, and it still to this day has strong links to British espionage, and this hotel was very close to places where this would have definitely occurred. The coat I saw matches exactly the kind of coats worn by the Navy during the 1960s. So from what I gathered, and since getting information about the detailed workings of the British government during the 60s is kind of difficult, I like to think that maybe it's the ghosts of someone who lost their life in my room when it was still a hotel during the Cold War, and they're still stuck here, waiting until they can pass on.
I'm in my late 60s, and I grew up in the Bronx. The Bronx isn't exactly known for supernatural activity, but I can tell you from living there for many years, a lot of strange things happen in New York, aside from the drug abuse and the crime that takes place in the back alleys. Let's go back in time to 1962. It was my 7th birthday. My grandmother got me this vintage Mattel Jack-in-the-Box. This was back when these kinds of toys were more commonplace. From the moment I opened the gift, I immediately got a bad feeling. Jack-in-the-Boxes are naturally creepy to some people, and I was never a fan of them, even as a kid. But I loved it when my grandmother came up from Brooklyn to visit us, and if I even hinted that I didn't like the toy she got me, my mother would have made sure I didn't sit down for a week. I don't know where my grandmother got this thing, but if I had to guess, she probably got it from one of the several pawn shops in the area. I think this is significant to point out, because this means that the toy was not bought brand new. It had a previous owner. After my birthday celebration was over, me and my dad put all of my presents in my room. I specifically remember setting the Jack-in-the-Box down in my toy chest. My family had this tradition where we would always gather in the living room and listened to some radio shows before going to bed. When 8 o'clock rolled around, I was told to brush my teeth and go to bed. When I was done in the washroom and went into my bedroom to turn in, I instantly noticed that the jack-in-the-box was now resting at the foot of my bed. I was confused because I remembered putting it away in my toy chest, but I figured that one of my parents might have been messing with me, so I placed the toy under my bed and tucked myself in. I ended up having these violent, horrifying nightmares over the next following weeks. I remembered seeing unspeakable things in my dreams. Everything is obscure to me now from the passing of time and my mind trying to block out certain things, but I'm confident that what I saw in my dreams was of a sexual nature. I would wake up screaming many times, to the point where my mother ended up taking me to the doctors to find out what was wrong. The doctors performed several tests on me and concluded that I was perfectly healthy and recommended that I be taken to a child psychologist. The night that I got back from the doctors was when this whole situation would reach its climax and conclusion. Maybe it's obvious to everyone listening to this what was going on, but at the time, I didn't really have a clue. I woke up that night, not from a nightmare, but from that feeling you get when someone is watching you. I had a nightlight plugged in next to my bed. In the dim light, I saw the jack-in-the-box my grandmother had gotten for me resting at the foot of my bed. That's when the unthinkable happened. It was like a scene straight out of a horror film. The crank on the side of the box slowly began to turn, and a distorted, slowed-down version of the melody began to play. When the tune finished, the clown inside the box popped out. Even though I saw it coming, it still made me jump. However, there was something else that I noticed that instantly made me forget all about the creepy little plastic clown. Recalling this now still makes my insides crawl. Looming just behind the toy box was a tall black figure. The only thing I could tell you about this shadowy presence is that it had these long horns on top of its head. I was raised Catholic, but I was never told at that point in my life about the fallen angel Lucifer, or his foot soldiers, commonly referred to as demons. My fragile little mind could not comprehend what I was witnessing, but I remembered my teachings about God's love and the power of prayer. So I closed my eyes and began to pray aloud. Shortly after I began my prayer, I heard a loud shrieking, as if I was inflicting pain to whatever was in my room. As soon as I opened my eyes, I saw that the figure was gone. The box that was still resting at the foot of my bed was now closed. We lived on the 3rd floor of an apartment building. Outside of my room was one of those stereotypical dark alleys New York City is known for. I opened up my bedroom window and hurled the box out. As soon as I threw it, I was expecting to hear it crash on the concrete below, but instead, I heard what can only be described as giant wings flapping. I didn't see anything, but I felt a gust of cold air hit me, and I quickly shut my window and ran back under the covers. I'm sharing my story to inform everyone that there are dark forces out there beyond our comprehension. You'll be surprised to hear that I'm no longer a part of any organized religion. I'm still a very spiritual person, and I do believe in a higher power. If you're confused by this, I'll try to break this down for you in the simplest of terms. Dark entities, like the one I encountered so many years ago, are comprised of energy, and they react to other energies in different ways. If you show fear in the face of adversary, they will feed off that fear and become stronger. If you show bravery and perform an act like prayer as a means to combat the presence, that is what ultimately drives them out. I believe wholeheartedly that you don't have to belong to a church or a certain religion to deal with an intruding presence. It was this event that inspired me to become both a counselor and a paranormal investigator. I have used my experiences with the paranormal to help many families across America. So if you ever encounter one of these dark spirits in your home, remember my words. Do not show fear. Be brave. And make it clear that they are not welcomed. The 80s were a crazy time in my life. I'm not proud to admit that I was a major drug addict back then. I've since reformed and I've turned my life around. I've been sober since 1990. This story was my wake-up call and the main reason that I left that life behind. Back then, I was working as a window washer in Birmingham, Alabama. I lived in a small apartment just outside the city. In those days, a lot of contraband came through there, and I was kinda sorta friends with my dealer. We'll call him Chris. I've known Chris since high school. He was always a bad seed, and had a criminal record the length of my arm, which is to be expected in this line of business. We had a sort of standoffish relationship. He tried several times to get me to hang out with him at parties, and go to bars and whatnot, but I always declined because I never fully trusted him. However, as my addiction became worse, I began to let my guard down more and more. It was on a Friday night. I remember this clearly because I had just gotten paid, and being the pathetic addict I was, I called up Chris as soon as I cashed my check.
Hello.
Hey Chris, it's Richie. Are we good for a meetup?
Yeah, I need you to meet me somewhere else tonight.
Why?
Because I don't want to get busted selling this shit to you in the same fucking place over and over again. The police came and knocked on my door this morning, accusing me of slinging dope.
Oh shit, really?
Yeah, and it's a good thing I don't keep my stash in my house, or I would have been fucked. But they are watching me, and I think someone is running their mouth.
Chris, I'd never...
Look, just shut up and drive out to the abandoned church. Be there by 7.
Chris abruptly hung up. The church Chris referred to was located roughly 30 minutes outside the city, towards Kohlberg. I had only been there once back in high school when a mutual friend of ours had a keg party there. I thought he was overly paranoid, wanting to meet me all the way out there, but I had to play by his rules since he was the one with the supply. I made the drive out there and was sitting in my truck outside the abandoned church, which was nothing but a heap of charred remains barely standing. That party I mentioned took place in 1981, so someone took it upon themselves to torch the place since then. This was before cell phones, so I pretty much just sat there and listened to the radio while I waited for Chris to show up. I looked at the clock on my dashboard and saw that almost an hour had gone by since I arrived, and there was still no sign of Chris. It was now dark out as well, which was making me feel uneasy. This church was off of a back road near Interstate 22, which was practically in the middle of nowhere. There were no streetlights or anything out there. It was when I was thinking about how if anyone was outside, the only thing that they would see is my truck's cab light, that I started to feel like a sitting duck. I tried starting up my truck to get out of there, but my dumbass had nearly drained the battery by sitting there with my radio on. As I tried turning the engine over, I got the feeling that eyes were watching me, and I turned on my headlights. I looked up, and a wave of dread overcame me as my headlights illuminated a horrifying sight. Standing in front of my truck were 3 figures. The first thing that my mind was able to register was a pair of antlers on top of a deer head, and for a split second, I thought maybe a trio of deer were standing in front of my truck. But as I looked closer, I saw the figures were standing upright, and I came to the horrifying realization that what I was looking at were 3 men dressed in deer skins. I began to panic and started to turn the key in the ignition. I didn't know who these deer skin wearing freaks were, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. As the sound of the engine failing to start rang out, I watched in terror as the 3 figures began to move closer. "Come on, you piece of shit!" I yelled as I slammed my foot on the gas pedal while continuing to try and start my truck. With each attempt, the headlights flickered, and as the figures slowly closed in, I could see that the middle one was holding a shotgun. I closed my eyes and began to pray for God to help me out of this situation while pressing down on the gas pedal. Suddenly I heard the sound of the engine roaring to life. I didn't have time to be relieved, as I quickly threw the vehicle into reverse and hauled ass. I looked up to see the deer people were much closer than they had been before, but that's not what scared me. What scared me was the shotgun pointed directly at me. Not a second later, I heard a gunshot, and I felt a hard thud as one of my headlights was blown out. I did not stop the truck as I quickly backed out to the back road and then floored it all the way back to town. When I got back home, I immediately called Chris, but there was no answer. The next day I drove out to Chris's trailer and knocked on his door, but no one came. I didn't know what to make of the situation, and I decided to call out of work for a week and lay low. Chris was found 2 weeks later, on the side of a road about 15 miles away from that abandoned church. He had been bludgeoned to death. I came to the police with my story and told them about what happened to me, but the death of a known drug dealer wasn't exactly a priority for them. They did, however, try to get me to confess to killing Chris multiple times, even after I showed them the damage to my truck. I could see the writing on the wall. The police were too lazy to investigate the case, so they tried to pin it on me, using my drug addiction to support their bullshit theory. They harassed me with parking tickets and stakeouts until I finally moved away a year later. I still have no idea who those deer people were, but I'm convinced that they were the ones who killed Chris. My guess is that Chris got to the church before I did, and they ambushed him. To this day, I'm grateful to be alive. The moral of the story is that you should stay away from drugs. Not only will they destroy your life, but they will also put you into dangerous situations like this one. If I were to give this story a title, I'd call it Scared Straight.